In Chapter 9, we're going to discuss right triangle trigonometry to begin with. So the first thing that we need to discuss is our 6 trigonometric functions. They are sine of an angle, cosine of an angle, tangent of an angle, secant of an angle, secant of an angle, and cotangent of an angle. In geometry and trigonometry, we typically use Greek letters to identify angles. And if it's just a single angle, most of the time we'll use theta. Other angles that you may see are beta, alpha, gamma. So we typically use Greek letters. Each one of our trigonometric functions is actually a ratio of 2 of the sides. And for right triangle trigonometry, they're the ratio of 2 sides of a right triangle. My recommendation is that you always draw your right triangles, that if I were to put them on a coordinate plane, that they would be in a quadrant 1 orientation. It makes, if you do the problems the same way every time, it makes them easier. First thing I want to do is I want to label the sides of this right triangle, and then we're going to establish the ratios. The side opposite the right angle in a right triangle is the hypotenuse. The other angle that's adjacent to our angle of interest, the other side that's adjacent to our angle of interest, would be called the adjacent side. And the remaining side is the opposite side. If, on the other hand, I labeled the other acute angle, call this one beta, the hypotenuse would remain the same. This side would have been the adjacent, and then this one would have been the opposite. Okay, so our trig ratios are based off of acute angles in the right triangle, and you need to make sure that you label your triangle correctly. And my recommendation, again, is you always put your angle of interest down in the lower left, and that way it's always hypotenuse, adjacent, and opposite. Notice when I wrote these down, I wrote theta, so I will be using the black labels when I start doing discussions on things. There is an easy way to remember which ratio goes with which. First thing I want to point out is these 3 functions are in the same order as the trig function buttons are on your calculator. This first one is abbreviated SIN. This is COS, and this is TAN. And the way I remember them is O heck, another hour of algebra. So O means the opposite side. H is hypotenuse. A is adjacent. H is hypotenuse. O is opposite. And A is adjacent. For the other 3 trig functions, if you remember them in the order of cosecant, secant, and cotangent, they are just the reciprocals of our first 3 trig functions. So you're going to have to remember some trig identities. The first trig identity is, if we look at this, the tangent is also the sine of an angle over the cosine of an angle. Because let's look at that. Opposite over hypotenuse divided by adjacent over hypotenuse. I'm going to flip it over and multiply. the hypotenuses cancel and I get an opposite over adjacent. So we have a trig identity here. That's called a quotient identity. The next three trig identities that we're going to have are reciprocal identities. The cosecant of an angle is 1 over the sine of the angle. Secant is 1 over the cosine of an angle. And cotangent is 1 over tangent of an angle. Abbreviation for cosecant is CSC. Abbreviation for secant is SEC. And abbreviation for cotangent is COT. If I take the reciprocal of sine, that means to take this ratio and flip it over, and I get hypotenuse over opposite. 1 over cosine says hypotenuse over adjacent. And 1 over tangent is adjacent over opposite. This is a quotient identity. These three are reciprocal identities. And I also have a quotient identity for cotangent, and that would be cosine of an angle over the sine of an angle. Well, if cosecant is 1 over sine, that means sine is also 1 over cosecant of an angle. Cosine is 1 over secant of an angle. And tangent is 1 over the cotangent of an angle. So here are 3 more reciprocal identities. So when you get to class, I'm actually going to give you a sheet that lists all of the identities that we are going to go over this year. And towards the end of chapter 10, you will actually take a test that covers all of these identities. So I would start working on them now. The first things that I wrote down with the sides, these are the actual right triangle trigonometric definitions. So if I ask you what the right triangle trigonometric definitions are, those are the ones that I put in boxes of purple. Now, I do not memorize cosecant, secant, and cotangent's definitions. I use the reciprocal identities. If you go beyond Algebra II, I would think of tangent not necessarily as opposite over adjacent, but start thinking it also as sine over cosine, because there's a lot of times that you're going to want to break it up when you start taking more advanced math classes. So these are our definitions. We have 6 reciprocal identities, and we'll have 2 quotient identities that we are going to start with. I'm going to pause the video, erase the board, and then we're going to go out how we use these identities.